She thought he was just another hungry kid asking for change outside the grocery store. But when she decided to follow him, she found herself frozen at his doorstep, holding her breath. What she saw inside would change her forever. Mariah had never liked stopping at this grocery store after dark, but the rain was coming down in thick sheets, and the blinking fuel light on her dashboard wouldn't wait until morning. She was in her late 30s, her hair tied up in a neat bun that matched her tidy, goal-focused life, every step planned, every list checked twice. She stepped from the automatic doors with her bag of groceries cradled in one arm when she saw him. A skinny black boy, about 10 years old, stood under the narrow overhang, soaked from the knees down, his too thin jacket sticking to his small frame. His eyes flickered up at her, uncertain, hopeful, but carrying the weight of something older than a child should bear. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice careful, respectful, as if he'd practiced these words many times before. "Do you have any spare change? I'm just hungry." Mariah stopped, the cold rain dripping down the back of her neck, her instinct telling her to walk on, to avoid the discomfort of this encounter, to stick to her plan for the evening warm. Dinner, emails, sleep. But the boy didn't push, he didn't whine. He stood quietly, his thin shoulders trembling, clutching the straps of a threadbare backpack. She glanced at him, at the worn shoes wrapped in silver duct tape that barely kept them together, at the hunger that was more than physical in his large, dark eyes. A part of her hesitated, a voice whispering warnings about giving to strangers, about enabling, about the safety of her bubble. But another part, deeper, older, refused to look away. She reached into her purse, her fingers brushing past the credit cards and folded receipts, finding a few coins and a crumpled dollar bill. She held them out, and the boy's eyes widened, not at the amount, but at the gesture itself, as if kindness was something rare enough to surprise him. "Thank you," he said softly, his small hand closing over the money, his fingers cold against her warm palm. Mariah expected him to hurry inside to the warmth of the store, to buy a sandwich or a piece of fruit, to tear open a wrapper with the desperate hunger of a child who had skipped too many meals. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped back into the rain, clutching the coins close to his chest, and began to walk down the street, away from the lights, away from the shelter. Mariah stood frozen for a moment, the groceries suddenly heavy in her arms, watching the small figure disappear into the darkness, each step deliberate, careful, as if he carried something precious he couldn't risk losing. Something inside her ached, an uncomfortable tightness in her chest as she loaded her groceries into her car, but her eyes followed the boy as he turned a corner. She should drive home, she told herself. She should mind her own business. But the image of the silver tape on his shoes and the quiet desperation in his eyes followed her, refusing to let go. With the rain tapping against her windshield like restless fingers, Mariah started the car and slowly pulled out of the parking lot, her headlights catching the rain in streaks of gold. She wasn't sure why she turned in the direction the boy had gone, wasn't sure what she would say if he turned and saw her following. But something told her that this wasn't about spare change, and she couldn't drive away until she knew why. Mariah gripped the steering wheel, the engine idling as her wipers beat a steady rhythm against the rain. She could see Eli's small frame ahead, his thin jacket clinging to him, the coins she had given him hidden somewhere in his pocket. She told herself it wasn't her place to follow him. She had done her part, hadn't she? A few coins, a moment of kindness, and she could go back to her warm house, her carefully scheduled life. But she didn't put the car in drive. Instead, she watched him pause at a trash bin on the corner, looking around as if checking for someone. Before lifting the lid, her breath caught when she saw him reach inside, pulling out a crumpled paper bag and inspecting its contents before dropping it back in, his small shoulders sagging as if the world itself was too heavy for him. Something twisted in her chest, A feeling she didn't have a word for, guilt, anger, helplessness. Maybe all of them, rolled into a hard knot beneath her ribs. Mariah glanced at the grocery bag on her passenger seat, full of fresh bread, cheese, fruit she wouldn't even finish before it went soft. She swallowed. She should drive away, she thought again. She should mind her own business. The voice of caution whispered that she could be putting herself in danger, that following strangers was how stories on the evening news started. And yet, she stayed. Eli moved on, turning down a cracked sidewalk that led toward a part of town Mariah had never had a reason to visit. She kept her distance, letting her car crawl forward, headlights dimmed, heart pounding in her ears. Every time he turned, she slowed, letting a few cars pass before moving again. He walked carefully, stepping around puddles, avoiding eye contact with people on the street. The rain had soaked him through, but he didn't seem to notice. She saw him stop at another trash bin, glancing around before lifting the lid, pulling out something she couldn't see, inspecting it, and dropping it again. She wondered if he was truly hungry, or if she was being tricked. Maybe he was part of a scam, a way to tug at the sympathy of people like her who drove cars they couldn't quite afford and lived in houses that were a little too big for one person. But as she watched him move, the thought felt hollow, like an excuse she was trying to convince herself of. Then he paused under a flickering street lamp, pulling something small from his pocket. The rain fell in a mist around him, the light painting a pale halo on the sidewalk. Eli unfolded a piece of paper with trembling fingers, smoothing it against the wall to keep it from tearing. Mariah squinted, leaning forward, trying to see what he held. It was a drawing, rough and childlike, lines wavering where the colors had run in the rain. Even from her distance, she could see the shapes, a woman and a child, standing in front of a small house. The woman had curly hair and a bright dress, one hand on the child's shoulder. The child in the drawing was small, smiling, his hand reaching up toward the woman's. Eli stared at the drawing for a long time, his thumb brushing over it as if he was memorizing it. Then, carefully, he folded it again and slipped it back into his pocket, clutching it close as he continued to walk. Mariah's throat tightened. This wasn't a scam. This was a child alone, holding on to something that mattered enough to keep it close even as the rain turned the world cold. She debated turning around. She could tell herself it was enough to have given him money, enough to have followed him this far. But then Eli turned again, down an alleyway lined with crumbling brick buildings, and the way his shoulders curled inward as if bracing against the world stopped her. She pulled the car to the curb, turning off the engine. The rain was steady now, washing the world in gray. Mariah grabbed the grocery bag, her steps hesitant as she followed him on foot, the cold biting at her hands, the air thick with the scent of wet concrete and rust. She stayed back as Eli approached. A building with broken windows covered by plastic and cardboard, the front steps cracked and dark. He paused, looking around, clutching the drawing in one hand, the other reaching for a battered door with peeling paint. His small body blocked the door for a moment before he pushed it open, slipping inside without looking back. Mariah stood there, the rain soaking her hair, her clothes sticking to her skin, the grocery bag heavy in her hand. She didn't know what she was doing, didn't know why she was here, but she knew she couldn't leave yet. The drawing, the taped shoes, the hunger in his eyes. Something was wrong, and she wasn't going to drive away until she knew what. The door Eli disappeared into was old and battered, the paint on it chipped away to reveal layers of colors from the past gray, blue, white, each layer telling a silent story of years gone by. Mariah stood at the bottom of the stairwell, clutching her grocery bag, water dripping from her hair and coat onto the dusty floor, her breath clouding in the cold air. She told herself again that she should leave, that she had no right to follow a child into his private world. But something about the way Eli had clutched that drawing in the rain, the way he had looked around with quiet fear, kept her feet rooted to the ground. She glanced up the creaking staircase, the banister polished only where hands had worn it. Smooth. Carefully she stepped forward, her boots echoing softly on the wooden stairs. Each step felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross, but she kept moving, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. On the second floor, the hallway smelled of damp wood and old cooking oil. She could hear the rain tapping against the boarded-up windows, a dripping faucet somewhere in the distance, and the sound of Eli's light footsteps ahead. She saw him pause outside a door, small shoulders rising and falling as he took a deep breath. He reached under a loose floorboard near the door, pulling out a small rusty key, glancing around quickly before slipping it into the lock. The door opened with a soft creak, and Eli stepped inside, careful to close it quietly behind him. Mariah stood a few steps away, her heart hammering in her chest, torn between retreating and staying. She stepped closer, peeking through a thin crack in the door, holding her breath as she looked inside. The apartment was tiny, a single-room space with a worn-out couch, a small table cluttered with pill bottles, and a hot plate sitting on a rickety counter. The wallpaper was peeling, the floor littered with threadbare rugs. A frail black woman, perhaps in her mid-60s, lay on the couch, her skin ashy and her hair streaked with gray, coughing into a rag that she quickly tucked under a pillow when Eli entered. "Miss Helen," Eli said softly, his voice trembling but warm. Miss Helen turned her head slowly, a weak smile forming as she saw him. "You're back, baby," she rasped, her voice thick with sickness. "I got you something," Eli said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the small loaf of bread he had bought with the coins Mariah had given him. Mariah felt something crack inside her as she watched Eli's small hands fumble to untie the bag, pulling out the bread with care as if it were made of gold. He placed it on the table before moving to the counter, reaching up on tiptoes to pull down a chipped mug. His hands shook as he filled it with water from a stained jug and placed a tea bag inside, setting it on the hot plate to warm. Miss Helen watched him with tired eyes, her hand reaching out as if to reassure him, but she was too weak to get up. Eli turned back to her, holding the steaming mug carefully as he brought it over, kneeling by her side to help her sip. The steam rose between them, the warmth fogging Eli's glasses. His eyes were focused, determined, but Mariah could see the fear beneath them. The way he bit his lip as he helped her drink, the way he tucked the blanket around her with trembling fingers. "You're a good boy," Miss Helen whispered, a tear sliding down her cheek as she looked at him. Eli smiled, but it was a small, tired smile, the kind that looked too old for a child's face. "I'm gonna take care of you," he said, pressing the mug into her hands gently before moving back to the counter, where he began to prepare a slice of bread with shaky hands. Mariah's eyes burned, tears mixing with the rain still clinging to her face. She pressed a hand to her mouth, watching this small boy carry the weight of the world on his thin shoulders, caring for a woman who was clearly all he had. She realized then what the drawing had meant. The woman and the child in front of a house. It wasn't just a hope. It was Eli's dream, his promise, a reminder to himself of why he kept going. And in that moment, Mariah understood that Eli wasn't begging for himself. He was begging for her. She stepped back from the door, clutching the grocery bag, her heart thundering as she tried to swallow the lump in her throat. She didn't know what she could do yet, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to leave him to carry this burden alone, not anymore. Mariah stood outside the door for what felt like an eternity, clutching the grocery bag so tightly the handles cut into her palms. She could still see Eli's small figure moving around inside, hear the soft clink of the mug on the table, the quiet hum of Miss Helen's labored breathing. She took a shaky breath and lifted her hand, knocking softly. For a moment, silence. Then the door opened just a crack, Eli's wide, dark eyes blinking up at her, his small face pale with fear and confusion. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Mariah swallowed, her own voice catching. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you, she stammered, rain dripping from her hair onto the floor. I was worried. I saw you outside the store, and she held up the grocery bag awkwardly, filled with bread, milk, soup cans, and fresh fruit she'd impulsively purchased after leaving the building. She didn't know how to say she had no idea what to do except to show up, to try. Eli glanced back into the apartment, then opened the door a little wider, just enough for her to step in. The room smelled of dampness and menthol rub, the heat from a small space heater fighting against the chill seeping through the cracked window. Miss Helen stirred on the couch, struggling to sit up as she pulled the thin blanket around her shoulders. Her hair, streaked with gray, framed a face lined with exhaustion but warmth. Her eyes met Mariah's, and there was a brief flicker of embarrassment before she forced a small smile. "Ma'am, you didn't have to," Miss Helen began, her voice rough with illness, but Mariah shook her head quickly. "Please, it's nothing," Mariah replied softly, setting the groceries down on the small table beside the pill bottles. "I wanted to help." Eli closed the door quietly and moved to Miss Helen's side, touching her shoulder gently as if to reassure her. His small hand lingered there, trembling slightly. "I'm sorry," Eli whispered suddenly, his voice breaking, as tears filled his eyes. "I didn't mean to scare you. I just needed to feed her." Mariah's heart squeezed painfully as she crouched down to Eli's level, looking into his tear-filled eyes. "You didn't scare me, Eli," she said gently, her voice thick. "You're very brave." Miss Helen's eyes glistened as she wiped at them with a tissue. "This boy, he's got more heart than most men I've known," she said with weak chuckle that turned into a cough. Eli's small hand immediately reached for the mug of tea, helping her sip carefully. Mariah looked around the room, her eyes catching on a stack of papers piled on a rickety chair in the corner. Medical bills. So many, most of them unopened, some stamped with red letters that read, "Past due" and "Final notice." She walked over, touching the top envelope lightly, feeling the weight of desperation that hung in the air. Miss Helen followed her gaze and let out a shaky sigh. "They just keep coming," she murmured. "But Eli, he just keeps going. Says we're gonna be okay." Eli looked down, embarrassed, clutching the edge of the blanket. "I can't let them take her away," he whispered, almost too softly to hear. "I just want her to get better." Mariah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, focusing on the small boy in front of her, on the frail woman who smiled despite the pain, on the tiny, cluttered room that smelled of sickness and hope. "You're a good kid, Eli," she said quietly, reaching out to gently squeeze his shoulder. "And you're not alone, okay? Not anymore." Eli looked up at her, his eyes wide, searching her face as if trying to believe her. His lower lip quivered, but he nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. Mariah stood, taking a steadying breath. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said, looking between them. "I'll bring more groceries, and we'll figure something out together." Miss Helen opened her mouth to protest, but Eli looked at her, and she closed it again, nodding slowly as another tear slipped down her cheek. She reached out to take Eli's hand, holding it tightly. Mariah turned to leave, glancing back one more time at the pile of medical bills and then at Eli, who stood next to Miss Helen, clutching her hand as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. And in that moment, Mariah knew her life had changed forever. The path she thought she was on shifting beneath her feet as she closed the door behind her. Because some promises are made not with words, but with the quiet act of showing up and staying. Mariah returned the next evening, carrying another bag of groceries and a small box of tea. The hallway still smelled of damp plaster and cold air, but she felt different stepping into that space now, as if it were less a stranger's door and more a quiet promise she had made to Eli. Miss Helen was sitting up in bed this time, her gray hair wrapped in a scarf, a knitted blanket around her shoulders. She looked tired but managed a warm, grateful smile when she saw Mariah walk in. Eli right behind her, proudly holding the bread they had bought the day before. Mariah set the groceries down on the small counter and began boiling water for tea. The kettle hissed and rattled, filling the room with steam and a small warmth that seemed to push back the heaviness clinging to the faded curtains. Eli pulled up a small, mismatched chair beside Miss Helen, his small hand holding hers as if he were the adult, as if he were the one holding her up. Miss Helen took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on Eli before looking at Maria. "You're kind, you know that?" she said softly, her voice raspy but clear. Mariah smiled, shaking her head. "It's nothing. I just want to help." Miss Helen's eyes grew distant, staring at the old floorboards. "You're the first person who's come by in a long while," she murmured. Since my daughter passed." Mariah paused, her hand stilling on the teacup. "Your daughter?" Miss Helen nodded, swallowing hard as Eli looked down, blinking fast. "Eli's mama. She was a good girl, but life was hard. She got sick, and the hospital bills ate everything we had left." Her voice cracked, but she held herself steady. "She passed 2 years ago, and it's just been me and Eli since." Maria's chest tightened as she glanced at Eli, who was staring at the floor, his thin shoulders trembling slightly. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand before looking up, his eyes clear but filled with something older than his years. "I try to take care of Grandma now," he said quietly. "I know she's sick, but I'm gonna get us a house one day. A real house with a yard and a kitchen that doesn't leak." Mariah's eyes burned as she placed the steaming cup in Miss Helen's hands, her fingers brushing against hers, feeling how frail they were, how the bones pressed against the paper-thin skin. Eli stood up, shuffling over to a corner near the old couch. He knelt and pulled out a small, battered shoebox, the edges held together with strips of clear tape. On the top, in a child's careful scrawl, were the words, "House for Grandma." He opened it, showing Mariah the small collection of coins, pennies, nickels, dimes, and a few crumpled dollar bills. Some of them were shiny, as if he had cleaned them to look new again. "I'm saving up," Eli said, his voice trembling but determined. "I'm gonna buy her a house one day so she can get better." Mariah felt her breath catch, the weight of the moment pressing into her as she looked at Eli's small hands, holding that box like it was the most important thing in the world. She imagined him asking for spare change, not for candy or games, but for a dream that felt so impossibly big in his small, determined hands. Miss Helen closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "He shouldn't have to carry this," she whispered. "He's just a child." Mariah knelt beside Eli, looking into his bright, hopeful eyes, seeing the exhaustion and fear that no child should ever have to know. She reached out, gently closing the box and pushing it back toward him. "You're a good boy, Eli," she said, her voice thick, "and I promise you don't have to carry this alone anymore." The rain started outside again, tapping softly against the glass. In that tiny apartment, filled with the scent of tea and the hush of quiet hope, Mariah felt something change inside her, a piece of herself that had been locked away by busy schedules and cold meetings breaking open. She glanced around at the cracked walls, the stack of unpaid bills, and the tiny shoebox of coins that represented a boy's unbreakable love. It struck her then that this was what resilience looked like, what family meant, what love in its rawest form could be. It wasn't about the big things or the perfect houses. It was about a boy trying to feed his grandmother, about a small room filled with love stronger than the fear outside, about showing up even when it hurt. Mariah stood, looking down at Eli as he hugged the shoebox to his chest, and Miss Helen reaching out to touch his cheek with trembling fingers. She realized this wasn't the end of her involvement. It was the beginning, and in that moment, she silently promised herself that she would help Eli find a way to give Miss Helen the home he had been saving for. Coin by coin, dream by dream. Mariah returned to her quiet, warm home that night, stepping into the soft glow of her neatly kept living room, the hum of her fridge, the click of her cat's paws on the tile floor. She dropped her purse by the door, removed her shoes, and let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. But Eli's eyes followed her everywhere. She tried to watch a show, but the bright colors on the screen felt hollow. She tried to read, but the words blurred, her mind drifting back to the image of Eli clutching that shoebox. The words "House for Grandma" etched into her memory like a quiet plea. The next morning, she stood at the window with her coffee, watching the sun rise, painting the sky in pink and gold. But it felt wrong somehow, knowing how dark and cold that small apartment must still be. How Eli was probably rummaging through the kitchen for any crumb to feed Miss Helen before heading to school. She mentioned it to her neighbor, Ruth, while they gathered mail at the apartment mailboxes. "There's this boy and his grandmother. They're really struggling," Mariah said carefully, hoping for a spark of shared concern. Ruth, a well-dressed woman with a tidy haircut, sighed, shifting her grocery bag. "Mariah, I know you have a kind heart, but that's not your problem. You'll only get yourself tangled up. These people. It's sad, but it's their life." Mariah forced a tight smile, nodding, but her chest felt tight as she walked back upstairs. At work, she sat at her desk, the glow of her monitor reflecting in her blank stare as emails piled up. She glanced down at her paycheck, freshly deposited into her account, and an ache rose in her throat. She had enough, more than enough. And all she could see was Eli's thin frame, the worry in his young eyes, the tired slump of Miss Helen's shoulders. The following evening, Mariah found herself back at the grocery store, pushing a cart filled with warm rotisserie chicken, fresh vegetables, bread, and fruit. She bought a pack of crayons, a small notebook, and a warm blanket, something that smelled of lavender when she hugged it to her chest. Driving to Eli's neighborhood felt heavier this time. The cracked sidewalks, the littered gutters, the teenagers on the corner who watched her with suspicion as she locked her car. She felt out of place, her nice coat and shiny boots too loud for these streets. She knocked softly on the familiar door, her breath fogging in the cold air. Eli opened the door, his eyes widening in surprise before breaking into a shy smile. "Miss Mariah," he whispered. Miss Helen was awake, propped up on pillows. Her face lit up with gratitude when Maria set the bags on the counter, the warmth of the chicken rising in the cold air of the apartment. They sat, eating together, Eli scooping mashed potatoes onto a chipped plate for Miss Helen, who took it with trembling hands. She closed her eyes, savoring each bite as if it were a feast. Mariah noticed the way Eli kept glancing at the window, checking the street, the fear of the world pressing down on his small shoulders. She longed to take it away. When she was about to leave, there was a soft knock at the door. A woman in a faded cardigan stood there, holding a clipboard. She was Eli's teacher, Miss Parker, stopping by to drop off homework. "Oh, you're Miss Mariah, aren't you?" Miss Parker said kindly, recognizing her from a school event flyer. "Eli talks about you." Mariah smiled, glancing at Eli, who blushed and stared at his shoes. Miss Parker lowered her voice. "He's one of the brightest kids I've ever taught. Reads above grade level, helps others with math. But he often comes to school hungry." She sighed, glancing at the small apartment, her eyes softening. "He tries so hard, but he's carrying a lot for someone his age." Mariah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you for telling me," she whispered. Miss Parker smiled sadly, ruffling Eli's hair before leaving behind the echo of truth in the small room. Mariah stood in the doorway, watching Eli clean up the plates, humming softly to Miss Helen, who was dozing off in her chair, the lavender blanket tucked around her. She realized how invisible they were to the world, how easy it was for people to look away. but she couldn't look away anymore. Driving home, the city lights blurred through her tears, a storm of thoughts in her mind. The groceries, the warm meals, they were only temporary. She needed to think bigger, to do more, to find a way to honor Eli's small, determined dream of a house for Grandma. The community may have chosen to look away, but Mariah knew she wouldn't. Mariah stood in the grocery store aisle, running her fingers over the labels of canned soup, rice, and boxes of cereal. Each item she placed into her cart was chosen with care, an echo of the promise she had made silently to herself. I won't look away. A warm roast chicken, apples, and a loaf of bread were tucked beside a pack of watercolor paints she'd chosen for Eli, remembering the drawing he carried in his pocket. She imagined him hunched over, carefully coloring the small house of his dreams. Driving through the cold evening, the headlights caught the cracked sidewalks, the darkness creeping around corners where streetlights flickered. Her heart pounded as she approached the crumbling apartment building, the groceries weighing heavy in her arms, and the promise of hope she carried inside her chest felt fragile. But when she turned the corner and saw the door, her breath caught. A bright red notice was taped across the wood, screaming in capital letters, "Eviction notice." She froze, the bags of groceries digging into her arms, the cold wind biting at her cheeks. Her mind raced: rent, bills, medication for Miss Helen. How could they survive this? She reached into her purse for the envelope she had prepared, her plan to help pay the overdue rent anonymously through the landlord. But her hands trembled as she clutched it, fear gnawing at her resolve. As she stepped forward, ready to knock, she heard footsteps behind her on the cracked walkway. Turning, she saw a man approaching, tall, with a weary face lined with years of worry. He wore a suit, slightly rumpled, and carried a briefcase in one hand, a social services badge clipped to his coat. Mariah's first instinct was to protect Eli, to shield him from whatever bad news this man might bring. She opened her mouth, but the man raised a hand gently, his eyes tired but determined. "I'm looking for Eli Thompson," he said, his voice tight, as if holding back emotion. Mariah swallowed, shifting the grocery bags in her arms. "Why? Who are you?" The man's lips quivered before he spoke. "My name is Daniel Thompson," he said softly, glancing at the door with glassy eyes. I'm his father." Mariah's breath caught. But Eli said, "I know," Daniel whispered, rubbing a hand over his face. "They told him I was dead. I was in prison, but I've been out, working, searching for him. I've been saving every cent to bring him home." The door creaked open, and there stood Eli, eyes wide, clutching the edge of the frame, the soft glow from inside illuminating his small, thin frame. The man's eyes softened, and the briefcase dropped to the ground as he fell to his knees. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he looked up at the boy. "Eli, I've been looking for you, son," he choked out, his voice cracking under the weight of years lost. Eli's eyes searched the man's face, confusion and hope dancing in his gaze as he stepped forward, the grocery bags Mariah held forgotten. Between them, Miss Helen appeared behind Eli, leaning against the doorframe for support, her frail hand on his shoulder, tears slipping silently down her face as she witnessed the moment she never thought would come. Mariah's heart pounded as she stepped back, tears streaming down her own cheeks. This was not what she had planned, not what she had expected. It was something far greater. And as the cold wind blew through the narrow hallway, Eli stepped into his father's arms, the world around them holding its breath as a family long separated found itself on a broken doorstep under the glow of a flickering hallway light, ready to begin again. Eli's small hand clung tightly to Mariah's as the morning light spilled across the cracked windows, washing the cramped apartment in gold. The air felt different, lighter, as if the weight that had pressed on their chests for so long had lifted with the dawn. Daniel, Eli's father, stood near the window, eyes red, his hands trembling as he placed them on Eli's small shoulders. The boy's dark curls glowed in the morning sun, And for the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to believe in the word home again. Miss Helen moved carefully across the room, frail but determined, tears streaming down her lined face. As she reached for her son's hand, "I thought I lost you forever," she whispered, her voice cracking under the memories of every hard year she had survived alone. Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding his mother close as they cried, the years of silence folding into this fragile embrace. Eli looked up at Mariah, his dark eyes glistening, and without a word, he squeezed her hand, gratitude shining brighter than the morning light. Days turned into weeks, and with the help of local services and Mariah's quiet advocacy, Daniel, Eli, and Miss Helen moved into a small sunlit duplex at the edge of town. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched, but laughter filled the space, echoing in the kitchen as they unpacked dishes, sharing stories between boxes of donated clothes and old photo frames. Mariah visited often, carrying bags of groceries, warm casseroles, and the watercolor paints she had bought for Eli. One afternoon, as they gathered around a small table for dinner, Eli showed her a drawing, a small house under a bright sun, 3 figures holding hands, smiling. Above it, he had carefully written, "My family." Miss Helen reached across the table, her wrinkled hand finding Mariah's, eyes shining. "You followed him when no one else would. You didn't have to, but you did," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her gratitude. Mariah smiled, blinking away tears as she looked around the tiny kitchen. Eli laughed as Daniel ruffled his curls, the sound of hope threading through the clatter of plates and the bubbling pot on the stove. In that moment, Mariah realized she had not only changed Eli's life by stopping in that grocery store parking lot, she had changed her own. She had learned that kindness was not just a gesture, but a choice, one that rippled out in ways she could have never imagined. Sometimes, following someone in need doesn't just change their story, it changes yours too. And as the evening settled around them, the soft glow of the kitchen light washing over the small family gathered around the table, Mariah felt the quiet warmth of a new beginning for Eli, for his family, and for herself.